Hey friends, welcome back to another Before You Read lecture for our Reading the Bible Together series, Lent in the Gospels. This is sadly the last lecture in this series on the Gospels, and this lecture will concern mostly the second part of the Gospel of John, and then just a little bit from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, sort of as a preparatory reading for our celebration of Easter at the end of Lent. So what I want to do, as has been the custom of these lectures, is I want to briefly review some of the high points of the key data related to the Gospel of John. Its sort of uniqueness, its cultural and historical context, and those sorts of things. And then I want us to walk through this week's readings, which are John chapter 13 through 21, and then 1 Corinthians 15. And then at the end of the lecture, as I've done in every single one of these lectures, you're probably getting bored of it at this point, is talk about the suggestions for how to engage the reading, as well as some questions that you might take to your journal, or at least to your thinking process. So to review a few notes about the Gospel of John again, the first thing to keep in mind is that the Gospel of John is well regarded, or often regarded, as the latest of the New Testament Gospels, and it's certainly regarded as the most unique of the New Testament Gospels. And that's both because of John's distinctive way of telling the story, but also just because of how closely related Matthew, Mark, and Luke are, those three synoptic Gospels. We see this in significant additions to the narrative. We see new characters, we see new interactions, but also really important subtractions from the synoptic tradition. So there's no Lord's Supper, for example, in the Gospel of John. There's 3 trips to Jerusalem instead of just 1 trip to Jerusalem. It is, in many ways, rightly described as the sort of spiritual gospel. It gets to the deeper meaning of Jesus, the deeper significance of Jesus. Jesus talks differently in the Gospel of John than he does in the other Gospels. We see this sort of spiritual or deeper significance to the life of Jesus insofar as the gospel describes his miracles not as miracles or deeds of power, but as signs. These select and limited signs that Jesus does somehow point beyond the sign itself to the deeper reality of who Jesus is. I didn't mention this last week, but it will be more relevant for this week's readings. We also see this pointing to the deeper significance of Jesus in the so-called I am statements. There are 7 of these in the Gospel of John where Jesus says things like, I am the good shepherd, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And again, these are signposts to the deeper reality of who Jesus is. In addition, one of the things that I reminded you all about the Gospel of John was the relationship between Jesus, the Jews, and the Christian community who would have been addressed by this writing. So at the narrative level, at the level of the story, there is this significant hostility between Jesus and the Jews. Notably, it's no longer Jesus and the scribes or Jesus and the Pharisees. It is the whole Jewish people, or at least that's one of the ways that we could read the text and the ways that the text has been read in the past. And this is a place where John's gospel has some of the harshest language against the Jews, again, seemingly against the whole Jewish people. Scholars have debated, and some have argued that actually the Greek word that is translated in a number of English translations shouldn't be translated as Jews, but should be translated as Judeans, suggesting a sort of ethnic or even class-based difference within the Jewish people. But again, even if one was convinced by that, it doesn't remove all of the potential for really problematic interpretations. And so, but that's only one level of the discussion. The second is what I would call the historical or the sociological level, and that is that the story about Jesus and the Jews seems to reflect or mirror the experience of the community who has experienced a significant break with the synagogue or with the Jewish society around them. And so the community's crisis, the community's hardship, is sort of refracted back into the story of Jesus. Not to say that the historical Jesus didn't have some conflicts with the Jewish religious leadership. That might have been the case. But the intensity and even some of the particular stories in the Gospel of John clearly are mirrors of the experience of a Christian community that has experienced some separation or some antagonism from a synagogue or from a larger Jewish society. For this week, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, we're going to finish the Gospel of John, John 13 through 21. And the first thing I want to say is sort of a general thing about this section of John's Gospel, and that is how the narrative slows down in John 13. Up to this point, the evangelist has covered something like 2.5 or even 3 years in Jesus' ministry. And then in 4 chapters, the narrative slows down, John 13 to 17, which amounts to maybe the last 36 or 48 hours in the life of Jesus. And the narrative just almost comes to a stop, a creeping stop. And in this section, Jesus speaks a lot. He speaks especially to and on behalf of and for his disciples. He offers them distinctive teachings and how to treat one another and how to expect God to show up in their lives. Scholars have suggested that this amounts to Jesus' last will and testament, a sort of last speech that a famous forefather or foremother or political leader or general might give in their moments before dying. And so it's memorable and it conveys some of the most significant or important teachings of that figure. And that's certainly what we have happening in John 13 through 17. So that's the idea. And then John 18 through 21 is all about the trial, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. So the first day of our reading, you'll be reading John 13 through 14. This is where we see the famous foot washing that corresponds to our celebration of Maundy Thursday. We get the new commandment to love one another in that way that Jesus has loved them. We get the promise of the Holy Spirit known as the Paraclete, the encourager, the supporter. Next, you'll read John 15 through 16. Again, Jesus is really focusing on his relationship with disciples, with their relationships with one another, and their relationship to the world. John 17 through 18. In John 17, you get the high priestly prayer is how it's often described. We get this beautiful and elaborate prayer of Jesus, largely on behalf of his disciples, but also in relationship to how they engage and are perceived by the world. And then in John 18, the beginning of the end starts. In John 18, Jesus experiences betrayal, arrest, and trial. In John 19 through 20, this is the crucifixion narrative as well as the first resurrection appearances. Then in John 21, we get additional resurrection appearances, specifically the appearance to Peter and the beloved disciple. It's notable to see that in both John 20 and John 21, there seems to be an ending, like a purpose statement for why this was written or its intentions and all of that. And this has suggested to some scholars that John 21 is almost like an appendix, or it's a tack on to the narrative that maybe more naturally ends in John 20. We can debate that when we're together. And then for the last day of your reading, I'm inviting you to read 1 Corinthians 15, which I know is not a gospel and whatever. But this is one of the earliest Christian discourses on the resurrection. It becomes really important in subsequent reflections on what is the nature of the resurrection, what is our hope in the resurrection. And because we're journeying towards not just the cross and not just the empty tomb, but also the promise of resurrection, I thought that this would be a really good chapter for us to consider. Here are the suggestions that I've made in previous weeks. The first is try to break up the reading and follow it on a daily basis if you can. Next, consider using a journal or even a Word document to capture your thoughts as you complete your daily readings. And third, open your reading time with a simple prayer of illumination. You might say, "Loving God, open my eyes and heart to receive what you would give me from your word." Or you could even pray as simply as, "Speak, O Lord, for your servant is listening. And then I've said these same questions throughout the weeks together for your journaling or for your reflecting. The first is, how would you summarize what you've read for that day in 3 or 4 sentences? The second is, what questions do you have about what you've read? What is unclear? What is confusing? What is confounding? The third question is, what issues in your life or in the life of the community does it address? What does it teach you about God? That's the fourth question. And finally, what does it call you to do? Well, this week's reading takes us to the end of the Lent in the Gospel series. It's been such a fun journey traveling with you all, and I look forward to our future journeys, but also our conversation about the end of John and the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians. I'm sure we'll have lots to discuss. For now, though, happy reading.